Hello. This lecture will cover a very common view in the philosophy of mind, which is known as dualism. It's a view with a very long history. Your textbook divides up the history of philosophy in a very common way, and that is into sort of three very broad eras, and covers the way that dualism has operated in each of those eras. The first of those eras is the era of ancient philosophy, and I think it does a little bit of good to understand a little bit of how these historical eras really are divided up. The ancient period in philosophy is divided up into two subsections. The first of which is the Greek period, which starts with Socrates. It's not that nobody was doing any philosophy prior to Socrates, but Socrates is generally considered the sort of foundation, the sort of inspirational character of Western philosophy. And Socrates died in 399 BCE, in February, actually. And we don't really know much about Socrates except through the writings of several of his students, most notably Plato, who himself died in 347 BCE, and Plato's most famous student was somebody named Aristotle, who died in 322. And so if there's ever a question in, for bar trivia purposes about an ancient Greek philosopher, the answer is probably Socrates, Plato, or Aristotle, right? You can almost not imagine any other answer. Again, there were other people doing things that were recognizably philosophy, but these three figures are far and away the most famous, and they did have something of a lineage. I will say that one of the historical events responsible for the spread of Greek intellectual culture into the Near East, sort of mostly eastward, was due to the actions of Aristotle's most famous student, a fellow by the name of Alexander the Great, who engaged on a large swath of conquest that brought Greek culture, especially Greek intellectual culture, into the ancient Near East. Later than the Greek period is the Roman period in ancient philosophy, and this occurs when the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, at this point they will turn into an empire over the next several centuries. The Roman Republic conquered a variety of Greek peoples between the period of about 200 BCE to 150 BCE, and adopted a lot of Greek culture. There was a very fruitful cross-cultural dialogue between Greeks and Romans for many centuries afterward, and largely it's the Romans that carried Greek intellectual culture to the West. So between the Roman conquests of the Greek peoples and Greek conquests of peoples of the Near East, most of the Western world then became influenced by Greek thought. And philosophy really does take up something of a steady march from these early origins. Now, of course, the divisions between what's ancient and what's medieval are not hard and fast. It's not like anybody ever woke up and said, "Oh, thank goodness the ancient period's finally over. Bring on the Middle Ages," right? I mean, they had no idea at the time, right? These are things that you can look back from a suitable distance in history and sort of draw some loose divisions. And medieval philosophy is different than ancient philosophy, mostly in that it is characterized by the influence of Christianity on really all aspects of Western life. Most of the people who were educated for the purpose of doing church business, that is priests and monks and a variety of friars, etc. And most social structures came to adopt a kind of Christian worldview. The church came to have a major influence not just on daily life but on politics, on all kinds of things. And so, look at those are some of the things that characterize the medieval period, and none of those things happened overnight. In terms of politics, Constantine legalizes Christianity after he converts, and it's some time before Christianity becomes the official religion of late Rome. And all of that stuff happens in the 300s and 400s AD. Or CE as the modern notation goes. And so again, there's not like a line you can really draw, but one of the most important early figures of medieval philosophy is Augustine, who died in 430 CE, and Aquinas, a really important late figure who died in 1274 CE. And in between those two, there's an awful lot of stuff, but it's characterized again by and large by the influence of Christianity on philosophy. Uh, Following the medieval period is the modern period, and again, it's really hard to draw any exact line anywhere separating the late medieval period from the early modern period. But I think if you are going to draw a line, a really nice one is 1450, which marks the invention of the printing press, which really does revolutionize, especially intellectual life all over the world, but in Europe especially. And so from there, about within about 100 or so years, you start to really see a marked difference in the way that philosophy operates. It tends to be much more secular, that is not as much concerned with church matters or with theological issues. It tends to sort of be moving toward a kind of materialistic or empiricist kind of viewpoints that start to really characterize the very much later modern period. And for all intents and purposes, you and I live in the modern period. The modern period is the world that was built by these modern thinkers. And if we do live in some other kind of a period, that'll be for historians 300 years after we're dead to decide for us, right? You really can't tell what era you live in when you live in it. But some major figures mentioned in this unit that are major to the modern period include people like Descartes, who is very often credited as being essentially sort of the kickoff, right, of the modern period. Although again, there's some people who are a little earlier that I think deserve some credit. For example, like Michel de Montaigne and some others. But those mentioned in our textbook that'll feature prominently include Descartes, who died in 1650, Locke in 1704, Hume, who died in 1776, a very easy date for Americans to remember, and Kant, who died in 1804. So that's again just a very short list of some major figures there. All right, so we can let's start with the way that the text discusses ancient Greek dualism. Right, this is a dualism coming out of the ancient period. And dualism in the ancient period is mostly due to the writings of Plato. Plato was a very committed dualist, and we mean dualist in the sense that Plato thought there are fundamentally two different kinds of things, hence dualism, right? That reality was dualist in nature, that human beings had a dual nature, right? And the most famous passage expressing this view, with respect to humankind anyway, is from his Phaedo dialogue, and I've reproduced it here. It's also in your text. But pay attention to what Plato writes here. And just as a note, when Plato writes, he writes Socrates as a character who's speaking to other people. So Socrates himself never wrote anything, at least certainly not that anybody ever said he wrote anything, and we don't have anything that survives that says it was written by him. And Plato wrote all these kinds of conversations that Socrates supposedly had with various other people, but Plato himself is never a character in any of his own dialogues. And so this is very interesting duality between Plato and Socrates, right? Where Socrates says all these things, but of course in reality didn't write anything. Plato's doing all the writing, but never actually says anything. So it's very interesting. But in any case, yes, the writing here is by Plato, and he is here relaying or sort of writing down a conversation that Socrates is having. So Socrates says, "And were we not saying long ago that the soul, when using the body as an instrument of perception, that is to say, when using the sense of sight or hearing or some other sense, for the meaning of perceiving through the body is perceiving through the senses, were we not saying that the soul, too, is then dragged by the body into the region of the changeable, and wanders and is confused? The world spins round her, and she is like a drunkard when she touches change." Right. So again, this is an important thing to consider. Again, the kind of dualism that's involved is the dualism of the soul being one kind of a thing and the body being another kind of thing, right? And that's the dualism implied here. So there's that people have a dual nature. They have a soul and a body, and the two are very different. Reflecting on the differences, Socrates continues. He says, when returning into herself, she reflects, then she passes into the other world, the region of purity and eternity and immortality and unchangeableness, which are her kindred. And with them she ever lives when she is by herself and is not let or hindered. Then she ceases from her erring ways, and being in communion with the unchanging is unchanging. And this state of the soul is called wisdom. And Seba says, that is well and truly said, Socrates. So sometimes in these dialogues, the characters will challenge him and they will challenge him back. But sometimes Socrates will go into a kind of a monologuing fashion where the other character really just says, yes, it is as you say. I completely agree. Things like that. Socrates then says, and to which class is the soul more nearly like and akin, as far as may be inferred from this argument as well as from the preceding one? And so he says, I think, Socrates, that in the opinion of everyone who follows the argument, the soul will be infinitely more like the unchangeable, right? That's one of the kinds of views that Plato had, is that the soul is this unchanging, sort of eternal thing, right? And Cebes says even the most stupid person will not deny that. Well, of course, a great many people might deny that, which is why Plato's taken the trouble to write out this large argument for it. You don't have to argue for the things that everybody already thinks, right? And of course, Socrates then says the body, right, is then more like the changing. The body is a temporary, sort of changeable kind of a thing, and so that again highlights the main features of Plato's dualism with respect to human beings. He thinks of there being a soul, an immortal, unchangeable, sort of steady soul, and the body as this sort of temporary thing that drags the soul along with it, or that the soul sort of uses to do certain things. It's again, it's very interesting as a view. And if you think that view sounds like maybe the view that you even have right now, the view has had a lot of legs, right? It certainly has continued sort of for a very long time and had a lot of influence, especially on Westerners. But there are alternatives, as we'll see toward the end of the lecture. Dualism in the medieval period has largely follows Plato's lead. And all the way through the medieval period, as sort of a Platonist philosophy starts to get meshed with a Christian worldview, you get this sort of dominant view of, especially the early Middle Ages, known as Neoplatonism, which your textbook mentions and explains briefly, very briefly. But a lot of that begins with Augustine, is credited to Augustine. He adopts Plato's dualism almost in its entirety, and then kind of overlays it onto Christianity in a way that actually proves to be quite influential, and we'll get to that on the next couple of, or really on the next slide there. By the late Middle Ages, again, there's a period of about 800 years between Augustine and Aquinas. By the late Middle Ages, Aquinas is interpreting Aristotle, who's actually recently been reintroduced into Europe in a story that's actually very interesting. Aquinas interprets Aristotle in a very dualistic way, and I think that the heritage that he's gotten from Augustine and the other Neoplatonists is really showing through here, because I think most interpreters don't think of Aristotle as a dualist, right? But it looks like Aquinas does interpret Aristotle in a fairly dualistic way, saying things like, the soul is what enlivens the body, right? For living things, to live is to exist, so the soul is that by which the human body actually exists. Now, a form is this sort of thing, so the human soul is the form of the body, right? So again, you're talking about this kind of dualistic nature. Now, maybe they're connected in some way, but they're certainly two very different things, which is not a view I think you really would have found in the classical Aristotle, but certainly one that is very easy for a person with a long heritage of dualism to make that kind of a reading. And what's very interesting about this dualism all the way through the Middle Ages, sort of Neoplatonism, is the contrast that bears to some of the very earliest forms of Christianity. So certainly Augustine, in sort of importing Plato's dualism, really is adding something new that was not necessarily there before, or if it was not in, in quite in the form that it ended up taking. And so I just wanted to, this is just an interesting historical note, right? I just wanted to contrast this. So here, what I've reproduced are a couple of some of the earliest documents from the history of Christianity that we have. There are a couple of letters written by Paul, and they just pay close attention to what some of them say. So the letter to the Thessalonians is regarded by most scholars as having been written in right around the year 51 because of some events that it refers to, and some you can sort of look up the dating on that if you are curious as to how they make that guess. That makes it again one of the earliest chronological pieces of information in about early Christianity. The Gospels are written at some point later. The earliest of them, Mark, is probably written in the late 60s and early 70s CE, because Mark clearly knows about the destruction of the temple, and that occurred in 70 CE. And so anyway, this is roughly 20 years earlier than that. And so this letter that Paul writes to the Thessalonians is clearly in response to a question, right? The Thessalonians have asked Paul, hey, what do we do with the people who among us in our communities who have died? Like what happens to them? As they of course expected the imminent return of Jesus. And so Paul says to them, he says, we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose, even so through Jesus God will bring with him, those who have died. For we declare to you by the word of the Lord, those that we who are alive, who are left until the coming of the Lord, will by no means precede those who have died. For the Lord himself, with a cry of command, with the archangel's call and the sound of God's trumpet, will descend from heaven, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Right. Now, of course, that's a little ambiguous, and if you have this kind of dualistic picture, you think of the rising of the dead as being a spiritual rising, that is, their souls will rise. But if that's the case, where are they now, right? Are the souls in the ground? I mean, no, the bodies are in the ground. So if you say rise, you mean bodily, right? And that's certainly what Paul appears to have meant. Making that somewhat more clear in a later letter, probably somewhere between 51 and 54 CE. In the letter to the Corinthians, he says, but someone will ask, how are the dead raised, and with what kind of body do they come? Not do they come in a body? He says, what kind of body? It's very clear he has the idea of a bodily resurrection, because he's not, as far as we can tell, a dualist, right? He doesn't think that that there's a separable body or soul, or that the soul is the eternal part of a person. And as such, I think Paul had an idea that was also very common in the ancient world. It was not the view that Plato had. So he continues, he says, but God gives it a body as he's chosen, and to each kind of seed its own body. Not all flesh is alike. There is one for humans, another for animals, another for birds, another for fish. There are both heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is one thing, and that of the earthly is another. We will not all die, but we will all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, the dead will be raised imperishable, and we, meaning the people who have not died, will be changed. That is, our bodies will get a new aspect to them, right? They'll get a new kind of body, right? This heavenly body, right? And so again, this is very non-dualistic, right? There's not two kinds of essence here. There's not a body and a soul. There's a body that changes, right? But it's still a body. And that's, like I said, that's as far as we can tell, the most common view in the earliest Christian centuries, or decades, I should say, rather, earliest Christian decades. And if you ask sort of modern Christians now what happens when we die, they'll say something like, well, when you die, your soul, right, goes one of a couple of places, right? And that tends to be the modern understanding. That's certainly how what Augustine thought, and I think many later Christians have adopted that kind of Platonist dualism, and that has become kind of the dominant story, even though it is a little bit at odds with some of the earliest texts that we have. If you're really interested in, the historical sort of account of how some of these ideas do change over time, this particular idea of sort of this importing of Platonic dualism into Christian thought, there are many writings about this. One book that came out very recently that's intended for a general audience that I think is pretty good is Bart Ehrman's Heaven and Hell: A History of the Afterlife. Came out again very recently. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, that's certainly something to read. All right, so if we continue into the modern period, we pick up with, again, one of the first really major figures of the modern period, and that is René Descartes, a French philosopher who was just a really bright light in a lot of different areas. Now, Descartes is a kind of modern proponent of dualism, and I think the text points out the sense in which Descartes really contributes to a lot of different big changes in philosophy. But one thing he doesn't contribute to a big change in is this notion of dualism. Again, dualism had been a common view since at least Plato, and Descartes really kind of goes with it, and in some sense is really the last very prominent dualist in the history of philosophy. For reasons that we'll discuss in subsequent slides. But again, Descartes does describe a very dualist picture. Among other things that he writes some in his second meditation, in the Meditations on First Philosophy. He writes as follows. He says, "Because I know with certitude that I exist, and because in the meantime I do not observe that anything else necessarily belongs to my nature or essence beyond my being a thinking thing, I rightly conclude that my essence consists only in my being a thinking thing, or a substance whose whole essence or nature is merely thinking," right? And so saying, a substance, that's a real key there, is because he thinks, again, in terms of a duality of substances, right? Not natures necessarily, but substances. He's really going to put a pin on that one. And he says, "And although I may, or rather, as I will shortly say, although I certainly do possess a body with which I am very closely conjoined," yada yada. So again, he thinks he is a thinking thing who has a body. Again, very clearly a dualist worldview. In fact, the particular kind of dualism that Descartes introduces is known as substance dualism. So philosophers are really, really good at naming things. We tend to call things such that, like, if you understand what the name means, you understand the view usually, right? So for example, substance dualism, right? If you just break it down, the word substance means stuff, right? I mean, and dual is, the dual means two, and so Descartes has a view that there are two kinds of stuff, right? This is the two stuffs view, right? And again, this view has a long history. And so the way that Descartes has it, there is a kind of physical stuff, right? That he refers to as body, or sometimes matter, right? Those are all sort of different ways of saying physical stuff, right? And there's also a mind stuff, right? That is a sort of soul or spirit, okay? So among the properties of the physical stuff include extension. That means physical stuff, body, matter, that they take up space. They have solidity, that is, they don't pass through each other, and that they're perceptible, that is, they can be touched and smelled and tasted and seen and stuff like that. And it makes sense because your eyes are made of matter, your hands are made of matter. That's matter interacts with matter in such a way, and that's what creates all these perceptions, right? But on the other hand, all these perceptions wouldn't be anything if you didn't like have somewhere to put the ideas or something. And that's kind of what he has in mind. He thinks there's this mind stuff. You could call it soul, you could call it spirit, right? He sometimes does each, and it's the stuff that is fundamentally sort of responsible for thought, right? Now, one thing I really want to mention is that Descartes' view of substance dualism has a very, very serious problem. A problem so bad that for the most part, dualism, certainly substance dualism, has largely been abandoned as a viable idea, which hardly ever happens in philosophy. Almost never do we like to put ideas down, certainly not for long periods of time, certainly not without trying to modify or sort of, having them inspire sort of new versions or, like I said, we like to play around with our ideas. We're never quite sure when an idea is definitively busted. But there have been some that have been definitively busted, and the substance dualism is about as close as they get to being really abandoned. And the biggest reason for that is this kind of what's known as the mind-body interaction problem. And the problem just starts briefly this way. We know that bodies interact with minds. Right? If you doubt this, like touch something, right? Your hand is part of your body. It's made out of matter, right? It's this physical stuff, and when it touches stuff, you get an idea about it. Or when light bounces off it into your eyes, you get ideas of what stuff looks like, right? So we know that bodies they interact with minds. We get ideas from our bodies. Our bodies cause there to be ideas in us. And so that's very clear. We think that that's fairly obvious. Also, we think it's pretty obvious that minds interact with bodies. I mean, if you doubt this, like, wave your hand. Okay, so the idea is you decide to wave your hand and then you wave your hand, right? I mean, so something's going on there. Certainly, you get at least some ideas have an effect on at least some physical things. And so again, we do know that minds interact with bodies. We do know that bodies interact with minds. These are things with which we're very clear. And the trouble with mind-body dualism is that it now has a really, really hard time explaining the interaction between the two, given that minds and bodies are distinct substances. They are different kinds of stuff. Right? If that's the view you really have, you start to, there's this really heavy explanatory burden for trying to say, okay, how is non-physical stuff supposed to affect physical stuff and vice versa, right? On what basis do they interact, right? Because if the idea is that physical stuff, say, can push non-physical stuff, that is, it can interact with it as if it were physical stuff, well, then you run out of reasons to say it's non-physical, right? But if non-physical stuff can make physical stuff do something by interacting with it, well, then you start losing the basis for saying it's non-physical, right? And so I would encourage you to pause this for a second. It's really important to think through the problem, not just be exposed to the problem. I think it's really good to realize yourself why this is such a big problem. So think to yourself, okay, what happens when you decide to wave your hand, or when you touch, something and get an idea about what that thing is like from the touch, right? Or from smelling or hearing or something like that. Keep in mind that your nose and your ears are made out of matter. Okay. And so really pause it for a minute. If you thought something like, well, when I decide to move my hand, my brain has these neural signals that, that trade chemicals and electrical signals back and forth, and that, causes my nerves to send a signal, which causes my muscle to contract, which, all that sort of stuff. Notice what you've done here. Your brain is made out of matter, and so are chemicals, and so are electrons. Electrons are matter. That's electricity. Your nerve endings or your entire nerves, they're all made out of matter. Your muscles are made out of matter. They do what they do by moving matter around and having matter pull on matter and push on matter. And notice you've not really brought in any non-material stuff. And the point at which you bring in the non-material stuff, right, say, okay, now how does that affect the material stuff? And again, if pause again and try and think of an answer to that question, because there is, it turns out, really only one correct answer. So I hope you've got the answer by now. You probably thought to yourself, well, it just does. The non-physical stuff it just does interact with, there's no laws, there's no, well, okay, you've described magic. Okay, and if you need magic to save a theory, or if the theory basically just is that there's some kind of magic going on here, it's not very good from an explanatory point of view, right? It can't really explain why anything is one particular way as opposed to another, versus other kinds of views. So how can you explain why you can move your hand by thinking about it, but you can't move your desk by thinking about it, right? Well, it's because your hand is materially connected to your brain, which is, and it's not materially connected to the desk until you like put your hands on the desk and then and shove it or something, right? And so it's not just, the idea of the mind stuff affecting things by just sort of some kind of extra natural force, also known as supernatural force, also known as magic. It's just an explanatory problem, and it's a bad explanatory problem. Certainly a problem that Descartes realized that he had with his view, and spent a lot of time writing letters to and from people who were like, yeah, boy, Descartes, I don't know. It's like, again, as natural as the sort of dualist picture sounds because of how old it is, I think that when you certainly when you put it this way and really think carefully about it, you start to run into some very serious troubles. So you might say, all right, how did Descartes to deal with this kind of a problem? And the answer is not very well. One of the things that Descartes very famously thought was that the soul, the seat of the soul, was in the pineal gland, which the pineal gland is a piece of not just human anatomy. Most animals have pineal glands or analogs to them, and that's just sort of a rough description of what it looks like and where it sits in your head. To the best of our knowledge, the pineal gland controls your circadian rhythm. That is, how you tend to get tired after the sun goes down and how you tend to not be able to sleep very well when the sun is up. That's circadian rhythm, and that's as far as we can tell what the pineal gland is primarily responsible for. But notice, saying the pineal gland is the seat of the soul doesn't actually explain anything. You're like, well, but it's made out of matter, isn't it? Right? What's so special? And so I have to say that some of the things that Descartes thought about the pineal gland were things that even ancient people knew were not true, and yet he sort of just thought so anyway. This is one of the few things in his life that he was not sufficiently skeptical about. But I think that some of the things that seemed important to him would strike a modern hearer as really more superstitious than anything. So let me describe a couple of the things that might have motivated him. So if you just look at this diagram here especially, doesn't that pineal gland look like it's in the middle of the head, right? It's kind of in the middle of the brain there, and yeah, middles are important, aren't they? Again, that sounds like it's a superstitious-y kind of a thing, but it makes it has a kind of appeal, even if it doesn't really mean anything. Yeah, it's in the middle, and it's also it's almost spherical. It's not quite spherical, but it's almost that way. You could like convince yourself that it was spherical if you sort of squinted hard enough. And spheres are like these perfect objects, right? That's got to be important, right? And again, number one, it's not spherical, and number two, no, spheres don't necessarily have to be important in any cosmic way. Also, most things in the human anatomy have like a bilateral symmetry. That is, there's like a left half and a right half. You got like a left lung and a right lung, you got a left arm and a right arm. Your face is sort of similar along a line down the middle. You got two halves of the brain, right? And it seems like almost every part of our anatomy is bilaterally symmetrical in that kind of a way. And it looks in a certain way that the pineal gland is just one thing instead of like having halves. As it turns out, it does actually have halves. They're just not as noticeable, right? But again, it looks kind of like it doesn't if you squint in the right way. And so again, maybe that's important, right? There's this unity, right? That, well, no, not really. And so again, this is this is the best Descartes could do. It's not very good, but partially as a result of that, you've still to this day got all kinds of bunkum and claptrap surrounding the pineal gland, as this is a picture of its anatomically, like in sort of a brain cutout or something like that, and you've got like, oh, looks vaguely like the eye of Ra, and that must mean it's the third eye or something like that, and there's fluoride like deposits there. Again, anytime somebody starts ranting about fluoride, you can tell you've gone off the pseudoscientific deep end. So in any case, that's it's not a very good answer. It's just notice that even if there were something special about the pineal gland, it doesn't actually solve Descartes' problem. It's still a thing that's made out of matter, and you still are left trying to explain how material things can affect non-material things and vice versa, without just saying, oh, it's magic. That's never been a good enough explanation, certainly not for philosophers of the modern period or later. Well, there are two ways out of this problem of mind and body interaction, the interaction between physical stuff and non-physical stuff, right, or mind stuff, as we might say. One of those is exemplified by this fellow pictured to the left of your screen there, is to keep only the mind stuff, right? Get rid of the matter. Again, if the problem is figuring out how minds interact with bodies, and again, without just appealing to something like magic, then, well, why have the body stuff at all? Why have the physical stuff, right? After all, aren't you more convinced that you have ideas than that those ideas are in some sense correct representation of something outside of yourself? I mean, Descartes' essential insight was that the one thing he knew was that he existed as a thinking thing. He knew he was thinking, even if all the things that he was thinking were mistaken in some way, right? So even if all of his ideas were mistaken, the fact that he has them must mean that he exists. And so again, his essence is as a thinking thing. And so Berkeley kind of picks this up a little bit, and depends on which Berkeley interpreter you read, whether Berkeley really believed this or whether he was sort of using it as a kind of for the sake of argument position in order to illustrate some of our conceptual problems with matter. It's very hard to say. But Berkeley did write he's one of our best examples of somebody who really did take this view seriously. This idea that you could get rid of all of the physical stuff, get rid of matter, just keep the mind stuff and have a worldview built around that. The approach is actually called immaterialism or idealism. Okay, those are both terms for the same basic view here. And its problem, it becomes explaining how matter really is just mind stuff, how the stuff that we think of as physical objects like tables, chairs, hands, feet, all that sort of stuff, how all those things are really just ideas, right? They're not actually a material there's not a physical substance. All there is perception. And it sounds like this view ought to be very easy to make fun of, and that's one of the things that's super, super interesting about it, is that it's not nearly as easy to make fun of as it should be, and it's in some sense internally consistent, right? It doesn't obviously contradict itself in any way. It just sort of goes contrary to, especially the expectations of a sort of late modern human being. And so if you're really curious about this view, it's not really mentioned in the text in any way, but it very well could be, and I almost think should be. But you could see, I mean, these are written long enough ago that they're all completely free. So the three dialogues between Hylas and Philonous is the more readable of the two. A treatise concerning the principles of human knowledge also makes some of the same points in favor of a kind of idealist worldview. So very, very interesting stuff. The other way out of this problem, and certainly the more common way out of this problem over a long period of time, has been to keep only the matter, the material, the physical stuff, and then get rid of mind stuff. It says, okay, there's just no mind stuff. All there is matter. And the problem for that view becomes explaining thoughts, ideas, something like that, as being just material, right? As in arising just out of matter. That is little tiny things bumping into other little tiny things, and that's all you got, right? To try and explain things like ideas and emotions and all that sort of stuff has seemed difficult to people over time, but again, this has been the main line approach, right? Most as the modern period has gone on, more and more and more philosophers have been convinced of one or another kind of physicalism or materialism. Again, both of those are terms that get used to describe a view like this one, where all there is physical stuff, right? That is all that exists as matter. And so even ideas, even beliefs, even thoughts, right? All of those things are really just something that material states are, or something that material states do. And that gets us into the later areas of the course. We'll pick up this thread, and as it turns out, there are several different kinds of materialist view about what minds are and what mental states are. And those are things that you'll see in subsequent sections of the reading and subsequent lectures to go along with them.